I'm going to start off with our panel. And you've got descriptions of, I'm not going to read their bios, you can read their bios yourself. But I'm going to start off with Tim Mauck, who's the, I hope I said that right, Tim, who is the Deputy Director of the Department of Natural Resources.
Good morning, Sue. Thank you. Thank you so much, Sue. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Let me go ahead and try and share my screen here, so bear with me. Appreciate the opportunity to be here, everybody. This is very exciting. My name's Tim Mauck, Deputy Director for the Colorado Department of Natural Resources. I've been on the job for about 18 months now, came in March of 2019. Prior to that, I was County Commissioner in Clear Creek County, and coming from the Department of, or actually then Division of Wildlife as their legislative liaison. Our mission at DNR is to manage and conserve Colorado's natural resources for the benefit of people today and tomorrow. There are, these are the agencies here on the screen that are within the DNR. We've got 1,500 full-time employees, a budget of nearly $340 million. Only 30 million of that is general funds and goes to mostly our water programs. And out of that budget, over $200 million is cash funded. This is very important. Our funds come from very specific sources, and so we've got certain restrictions in terms of the way that they might be used. Volunteers contribute approximately 121,000 hours each year. That's the equivalent of 58 full-time employees and a value of $4.3 million. So as you kind of understand our operations, we certainly couldn't do that without our volunteer assistance. Now, I want to spend some of this opportunity here to discuss the organization, our priority programs and initiatives, as well as some challenges, and identify some touch points with pollinators. Here we've got the 2020 WIGS, wildly important goals that are set annually between the governor and our executive director, Dan Gibbs. You can see that our WIGS is for this year, and it runs a fiscal year as track and prioritize water project needs, balance outdoor recreation and conservation, and work to find sustainable funding for Colorado parks and wildlife. You can actually track all these WIGs on the website at dashboard.state.co.us. Speaking of that, well, I kind of want to, when we kind of talk about the WIGs in the budget here, I want to kind of step into Parks and Wildlife's annual revenues here and help you understand again a little bit about our budget, some of the challenges that we're working with. While our state parks, wildlife areas, and open spaces undoubtedly help boost our economy, how our state funds our wildlife resources and outdoor recreation is facing future challenges. Let me, like I said, focus on parks and wildlife here and their budget. As you can see, well over half of our budget to be stewards of Colorado's wildlife is supported by hunting and fishing licenses. Of those licenses, the bulk of those revenues are generated by out-of-state hunting licenses. Coloradans on a whole do not pay into the management of our wildlife resources. Some might say we've had it relatively good. But here's one of the big challenges that we've identified that we're facing is that today only about 5% of Americans 16 years and older actually hunt. That's half of what it was 50 years ago, and the decline is expected to accelerate over the next decade. Factor this with our budget, our funding, our ability to successfully manage wildlife is not sustainable into the future. The user play, user pay system for wildlife conservation has been incredibly successful for decades. But as Colorado grows and more people hit the outdoors and trails, we are seeing impacts, significant impacts to our natural resources. Let me just kind of put this in some perspective. Montana is a third the size larger than Colorado and has a population of only about 1 million people. Wyoming has just shy of 600,000 people, whereas Colorado has 6 million residents and 85 million visitors a year. According to the state demographer, in the last 20 years, Colorado's population has increased by a little more than 1.5 million, And since 2010, we have welcomed about 700,000 new residents. On average, the state is growing anywhere from 70 to 80,000 people per year. And we understand that about 92% of Coloradans recreate outdoors and 62% in our state parks. Now, we've historically divided up recreation by consumptive hunting and fishing and non-consumptive hiking and wildlife watching. But the reality is we're all consumptive in that we are having a collective impact on our wildlife and natural resources. Now that I've kind of laid some of that groundwork, let me shift to our programs and initiatives. You may be familiar with DNR's Pollinator Conservation Policy. Sue had mentioned this. It was issued in November of 2018 by then Executive Director Bob Randall. It's most specific to 4 of our divisions, Colorado Parks and Wildlife. We operate 42 state parks, over 300 state wildlife areas. We've got multiple programs that have some touch points with pollinators. The Resource Stewardship Program supports conservation of wildlife and habitats in state parks. Colorado Natural Areas Program is a statewide conservation program that supports conservation of Colorado's most significant natural features, including quality representative plant communities, rare plants, and invertebrates through the identification and designation of these significant places. We also have the Corners for Conservation program that's improved over 3,000 acres of Colorado Eastern Plains habitat for wildlife insects through restoration plantings of wildflowers and legume species. And then we've also got the Parks and Wildlife Native Seed Warehouse. It's a facility in Delta that was created to store native seed collected by volunteers and grown for bulk storage of native plant seed for restoration projects on the western slope. Another sort of touch point here with our divisions is the Colorado State Land Board. I know Mindy is going to go into some greater detail on this, but it's essentially, it's requiring the use of only native species when revegetating disturbed sites on state trust lands, and documenting pollinators observed on rare plants on trust lands, and providing this info to our Colorado Natural Heritage Program. And then also the Division of Reclamation, Mining, and Safety. If there's any indication, we've got an abandoned mine program. It's a very robust abandoned mine program. If there's any indication of abandoned mines being used by bats as their home, the program installs closures that allow that access by the bats. My understanding, or our understanding, is over 500 species of flowers, including 300 species of fruit, rely on bats as their major exclusive pollinator. And then the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission is encouraging the use of native species for both interim and final reclamation. And then we do have some requirements here that we ask our divisions consider the pollinator conservation when making habitat management decisions, development of pollinator conservation strategies, and incorporate pollinator conservation strategies in property management. Now, we do have a requirement in there to report annually, or have the divisions report to the executive director's office. We've got to, I will admit, we've got to get ahead of that a little bit, and certainly did not have an opportunity to pull that together this year, given some of the challenges. I kind of want to go now into some climate change here. It's hard to talk pollinators, I think, without talking about climate change, or really anything in regards to our natural resources today. We are thinking about everyone who's affected by this year's unprecedented wildfires, and like you, are concerned about the impacts on our communities, forests, rivers, and watersheds. This year especially highlights the need for our state to take bold action on climate change. And our department was proud to work with Governor Polis and the rest of our state departments to do our part on the greenhouse gas reduction roadmap. Climate change impacts everything we do at the Department of Natural Resources, from contributing to more frequent large wildfires, as we've seen this summer and fall, to impacts on our fish and wildlife and our recreation industry, and poses a huge challenge for water planning in the coming decades as people move to our state. At DNR, addressing climate change is one of our top priorities, and certainly is for our Executive Director, Dan Gibbs. We've hired new staff exclusively to focus on climate change and tell all staff to incorporate climate change into everything we do. As described in the roadmap, if you've had a chance to take a look at that, at DNR, we're tackling climate change in many different ways. We know that natural climate solutions have a big role to play in sequestering carbon in our soils, forests, grasslands, riparian areas, wetlands, and even our urban green space. But we can't manage what we can't measure, and tracking emissions and carbon sequestration from our natural and working lands is arguably the most complicated part of any emissions inventory and greenhouse gas reduction plan. That's why we're committed to the U.S. Climate Alliance Natural and Working Lands Challenge. Our staff are researching ways to improve this portion of Colorado's greenhouse gas inventory and track it separately so that we can actually verify the results of policies and programs to protect and enhance carbon storage in our natural lands. We also launched an interagency natural working lands task force. It's in partnership with top experts from the nonprofit and academic communities, including the Nature Conservancy, and is conducting a state-of-the-art analysis to identify the most effective natural climate solutions to implement here in Colorado. We're also working with the Colorado Department of Ag, and Cindy has been a tremendous partner in that effort as well. But we aren't waiting to take action. We know that land and ecosystems conservation is crucial for protecting carbon storage, and conservation is a top priority for the Department of Natural Resources. Last Friday, we opened our state's newest and second largest state park, Fisher's Peak, down in Trinidad. And our state land board is aggressively pursuing renewable energy leases on its lands, which fund our schools. The Colorado State Forest Service is working with our federal partners on the critical work of improving forest health. And we've had many reminders this summer of how important this forest restoration work is. We also know that there's some key priorities for Colorado is to reduce methane emissions from oil and gas industry. While the authority to regulate the emissions lies within the Department of Public Health, the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission within DNR is currently, and actually as we speak right now, undergoing a major rulemaking to strengthen protections for health, safety, welfare, the environment, wildlife resources. It established how the Oil and Gas Commission will coordinate with CDPHE to reduce emissions in the oil and gas sector. A little bit kind of jumping back to the natural climate solutions and our newest state park, Fisher's Peak. I'm certain you all have heard of this. It's 19,000 acre property down near Trinidad, which connects grasslands to the east with foothills and the mountains to the west, and contains the highest point in the Colorado east of I-25. I want to highlight this as another example of DNR's natural working land solutions, land conservation. We know land conservation is a critical strategy moving forward to combat climate change, but also preserve space for our biodiversity, including pollinator species. We have numerous programs and tools that we are working to align at a landscape level strategy for land preservation. You're probably familiar, might have heard of the 30 by 30 report, for example, by Conservation Colorado that was released, I believe, 2 weeks ago now, challenging us to protect 30% of Colorado's lands and water by 2030. In Colorado, we have nearly 67 million acres of land in Colorado. And from 2001 to 2017, we've lost about 1,000 square miles of natural lands to development. At this point, about 28% of Colorado, an area roughly the size of South Carolina, has been developed for human purposes, such as residential areas, energy development, transportation. In Colorado, not only is this loss of nature dramatic and devastating, we are also experiencing the impacts of climate change, as I mentioned, in the forms of increased wildfires, decline of wildlife, increased drought, etc. And again, we're really trying to focus here. The data from the United States Geological Survey shows that about 10% of Colorado is already conserved with permanent or otherwise durable land protections for managed for biodiversity. And we think that increasing, or at least the report explains that increasing of the share of protected areas in our state to 30% will take collective efforts of all Coloradans, which we certainly agree with. A couple of other large initiatives, and I think this is kind of probably the theme for the last year and a half, is large collaborative coordination with our local, state, and federal partners. We've got shared stewardship. 15.9 million acres of Colorado forests and woodlands are in federal ownership. 11.3 million acres are national system forest lands. And they're managed for a range of, we're facing a range of urgent challenges, a lot of which I've already kind of gone over here. And we're working with the feds to identify shared priorities and goals that will be derived from several primary themes: ecological restoration, sustainable recreation, protection of water resources and critical infrastructure, conserve and protect wildlife, and keep our communities healthy. And we're really focused on landscape level collaboration with the Forest Service. This is best manifested, or I think sort of identified through our work with the Rocky Mountain Restoration Initiative. It is a pilot program essentially here in Colorado in partnership with the Forest Service and the Wild Turkey Federation to identify a landscape for shared stewardship project. We aim to leverage existing partnerships and potential federal funding above and beyond to create measurable and scalable results in the restoration of critical landscapes in the Rocky Mountains. The Forest Service and our partners are already working across the boundaries, but not at a scale that will protect communities and in our water supply should a large wildfire occur in the wrong place at the wrong time. As you can see, this project here that we're focusing on in the Southwest Colorado spans from all the way from Dove Creek to Bayfield. And we hope that this will be an example of a larger landscape level project and really be replicable into the future. And then obviously we're dealing with some challenges here that everybody else is dealing with. We've been working hard to balance the budget and certainly have faced significant challenges with the general fund and those impacts. We do have most of our employees that have been working with home. The transition has been relatively smoothly, but it did take some effort earlier this year. Given that budget, I do want to spend some time on the budget that was just unrolled the other day. And let me just conclude this part of my presentation with these last kind of thoughts. The governor's budget includes a total of $316 million for DNR and protects funding for our high priority programs, even in this challenging budget environment. It maintains funding for the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, Parks and Wildlife, and the Division of Water Resources and Water Conservation Board. We've experienced, obviously, again, one of the worst wildfire and drought seasons on record, and we are at a critical juncture between growth in our population, increased demand for outdoor recreation, and increasing risk of wildfire due to climate change and other factors. Therefore, we've requested 2 installments of $10 million for 2 grant programs that will provide 1 immediate support for recovery and restoration projects in response to the wildfires, and 2 longer-term investments in wildfire mitigation, forest and watershed restoration, and large-scale stewardship projects. That includes the $6 million there that you see and the $4 million, and then an additional $5 million to each of those programs in fiscal year 22. And then in addition to that, we've got a stimulus package of $20 million in a one-time funds to make targeted investments in projects to expand our capacity, our state parks, new campgrounds, improved amenities, increased recreation opportunities. These projects will improve the visitor experience and alleviate pressure from increasing state park visitation and support the economies they are located near. And then finally, that request includes several other items that will support our wildly important goal to balance outdoor recreation with conservation, including staff and resources to support public access at Fisher's Peak and our new state park, and a coordinator to facilitate collaboration on efforts to improve big game migration corridors in Winter Range. And so with that, I will just leave you with my contact information. Feel free to reach out at any time. And again, I appreciate this opportunity to discuss the Department of Natural Resources. Thank you.
I did want to mention something that I neglected to mention in the introduction before I move on to Mindy, who will be presenting next. So Mindy, tee up your presentation. That last year in the state legislature, PPAN did not introduce two bills, but we introduced one bill, and then Environment Colorado introduced a bill, or got organized the sponsors to introduce the bill. One bill was to restore more local control to communities around pesticide management, and being able to have a little bit more control in saying, we don't want to use pesticides, or we're going to ban pesticides in certain areas in our local community as needed if it's threatening water supplies, or other lands or other things. So that was really addressing the pesticide preemption. And then the other bill which was introduced was one to change how neonics are regulated and registered, and to make because it currently consumers can buy neonicotinoid pesticides off the shelf and do not necessarily require training in order to utilize them. And so that bill was addressing the use of pesticides by the public, in essence. Both of those bills got preempted at the state legislature by COVID. So when the legislature shut down and wasn't able to continue, those bills were in process. Whether or not they get reintroduced this year is a question mark. And some of that has to do with, is the legislature going to be able to do much of anything beyond addressing the budget shortfalls and the COVID climate? And if you remember, the legislature starts in January, and things aren't looking good in terms of the COVID trajectory, and no one really knows what it's going to mean in terms of what the legislature is actually able to do. So there's just some question marks about what will be introduced in the next year. So I wanted to point that out because there were a couple of comments on that I saw in the chat.